What's up guys, Kudo-kun here. What if I told you that there used to exist a card game where your Link could use the Kamehameha wave to blow up Inuyasha? Your first instinct might be that the reason I don't upload videos anymore is that I'm on a powerful new hallucinogenic drug. But your second instinct might be that I am totally screwing with you and you probably just checked the date right now to make sure that I'm not pulling an April Fool's joke. While the first one is 100% reasonable, and the second one does sound like something I would do, I do in fact have proof that this game existed. Not only do I have proof that this game existed, but I had the chance to not only play it, but also talk to the creator about when it was first created. The game was created 15 years ago, and the creator used to make the game alongside a bunch of other card games, which I relate to because, as you may know, I used to make card games as well. And this game is just so weird that I really wanted to share it with you guys because I think you guys might enjoy just how weird and strange it is. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dudes of all teen ages, jump into the rabbit hole with me and let's check out TGC the TCG. Let's start by taking a look at character cards, and do not adjust your screen, ladies and gentlemen. This is in fact what's really happening right now. Along the top of the card, you'll see an HP and a level, as well as the character's name. Sonic has 160 HP and is a level 1 card. Characters can go up to level 5, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Below that will be the character's technique, which is usually some kind of attack, but sometimes is only an effect. The number in the middle of the card that has an X next to it is the power of the attack, and the X has a significant meaning that we'll talk about a bit later. The number on the right is the attack's cost. Characters are limited in what they can do by a resource called charge, so in this case Spin Dash would cost us 20 charge points to use, and it has an attack of times 10. Below the character's technique, every character will have some kind of defensive technique as well. The defensive technique is normally a generic command called defend that has some kind of minus value next to it. In level 1 Sonic's case, he has a defend of -1 that costs 10 points to use. I know this numbering system might sound quite confusing, but trust me, when we actually get into how the game is played, this will start making a lot more sense. Just know that this card can defend for -1. The last line we have here is the character's charge value. So rather than using Sonic for his spin dash or his defend command, you can actually use him to charge to refill your charge points. You can use the charge value to tell a lot about this card. It charges for +5, and its attack costs 20, so this isn't necessarily a character that wants to sit back and charge. He's more about getting into the fray and attacking. Finally, on the bottom of the card we'll have the word Emerald. This is the character's job. These usually don't have a specific purpose outside of just adding flavor to the character, but sometimes this actually lets the character do some special things within the game by interacting with other card types. So you can have an entire archetype deck around Emerald characters, for example. Before we move on, we have to stop for a second and explain how the combat works, or none of these other cards are going to make any sense. Let's say for a second that we have Sonic in play, and our opponent has Mega Man EXE in play. We're in battle and I decide to use the move Spin Dash. It costs me 20 charge points and it has an attack of times 10. Now our opponent can choose how to react. They can charge, which would mean they would take the full brunt of the attack, but also gain 10 charge points to use on attacks for later. They can defend, which in Mega Man's case is free and does have a value of -1, again we'll talk about that later. Or they can attack back with a Mega Buster attack, which costs 20 just like our Spin Dash. Let's just say for the sake of argument that that's what Mega Man decides to do. Mega Man now also has an attack value of times 10. As some of you may have figured out, this is only the character's base power. Now we're going to roll a dice to see what our total attack power will be. Our Sonic rolls a 5 and our opponent's Mega Man rolls a 3. So if we multiply the numbers together, our attack is 50 and our opponent's attack is 30. This is called your critical multiplier, and it's what sets the game apart from other games. Even though our attack powers are the same, we don't actually know how much damage we're going to do until after the critical roll has happened, so there's no guarantee that you're ever going to win a match. A random luck value like this might turn a lot of you off, but if you keep an open mind, I think you'll find that this system leads to a lot of very interesting moments and interactions within the game. Let's say in this next example that we have a Knuckles level 1 in play and our opponent is attacking us with a level 3 Inuyasha. Our opponent's base power is 50. We decide to counter with our Knuckles anyway, who has a power of times 20. Our critical roll is a 5, and our opponent's critical roll is a 1. This means that even though our base power was much lower, only being a times 20, and our opponent's base power was much higher, and our opponent was a much higher level, we still managed to come out on top due to our lucky roll. So we win the battle by 50, and our opponent's Inuyasha will take 50 damage, due to it being the difference between our two attack values. There's one last thing we have to talk about regarding critical rolls, and that's the golden rule of TGC. 6s are always treated as 0. Always. There are no exceptions to this rule when you're rolling to see who goes first, when you're rolling for a card effect, and when you're rolling for critical. If you roll a 6, you treat it as a 0. The game is meant to work on multiples of 5, so getting rid of the 6 does kind of make sense. This also added another level of unpredictability, because if you ever rolled a 6 on your critical roll, it doesn't matter what your attack value was, your total attack power would end up being 0, giving your opponent a free attack. So even if our opponent's staring us down with a big, beefy Goku level 5 with a times 100 attack, if this 0 pops up on the dice block, Goku's attack power is 0, and whatever attack he's going against, he is going to take some damage from and lose the combat. This added yet another layer of luck to the game, because no matter how powerful your character was, everybody was susceptible to rolling a 0. And the other cool interaction this has is the strongest attacks in the game will be from level 5 characters, and some of them have times 100 attacks. And all level 5s in the game have a max life value of 500. So that means if one character rolls a 5 and gets a 500 total attack and the other one rolls a 0, you could insta-shot one character by just one attack. There's a little bit more that goes into combat, but we'll talk about it a bit later. We need to look at the rest of these cards. The next ones we'll look at are equip cards. Equip cards usually either gave a character some kind of utility effect or a long list of attacks they could use in succession. Up here will be the card's name. You should recognize it even without the name, but it is the Master Sword, so there you go. Equip cards will give your character a list of new jobs. Again, these jobs are normally for flavor, but sometimes they actually do have interactions within the game, so it is important to keep track of them. The equipped character of the Master Sword gains the job Swordsman and the job Hero of Time. Now for this big, long, beefy list of attacks. Equip cards work like this. You start with the attack on top, and then you work down the list until you hit the final attack. This is called an equip combo, and you can choose to stop the combo at any time you wish, but if you do, you cannot come back and reuse the unused attacks. So once you stop, that's it. You cannot continue until the next time you go into combat with this card untapped. The bottom attack, Banish, is our first example of an attack technique that also has an effect. In this case, you can see how some jobs played a role in the game. In Banish's case, if you can find any of the listed jobs on the character you're attacking, then your opponent does not clash with this technique. By the way, clashing is when your opponent gets to choose some kind of technique to use against you in battle. So when two attacks hit each other, it's a clash. When you attack and your opponent defends, it's a clash. Essentially, your opponent has to take the damage from Banish and they cannot react to it. Equip cards are character unique, so you cannot have a character with two Master Swords, but you can have two different characters, each with a Master Sword, and you can also only have 3 equips on a character at a time. If you already have 3 equips on a character, then that's it. You cannot equip Master Sword to that character, or any other equip for that matter. Next up are events. Events essentially are just a name and some kind of effect, sometimes a limit, as you'll notice on this card. Events are essentially instant, and time stops when one is being used, so you can use one in the middle of battle, you can use one after a dice has been rolled, you can use one essentially anytime you want. There are also no limits to the amount of events that can be played in one turn, so go crazy. Once you've used an event's effect, the event is sent to the discard pile. That's it for the cards that will be in your deck, but you'll have 2 cards with you that will not be in your deck. one of them being your location. Locations will have a name along with the word location and some place within that card's universe where the location would be. In the case of Planet Namek, it's in the North Galaxy. Again, this doesn't have anything specifically to do with the card game itself, but it is just nice for flavor, and you can also use it to notice when a card is a location or not. Most locations will have a once per turn effect you can take advantage of. In the case of Planet Namek, you can roll a dice, and if the number is above 3, draw one card. Don't forget, 6s are zeros, so if you happen to draw a 6, it counts as a 0 and you don't get the draw, making this a 1 out of 3 chance. The last thing we'll look at are level 0 characters, because you'll have one outside of your deck before the game even begins. Level 0s are essentially the exact same as regular characters, but they do serve a special role. Everybody will start with a level 0 acting as a guardian being essentially a commander of your deck. The game works on a system very similar to life points from Yu-Gi-Oh! And in this case, if your life points, or in this case, Crash Box, is going to take any damage, you can have it taken to your Guardian instead. There are other things that make Guardians useful as well. For example, you'll notice that Master Roshi has a charge value of plus 30, so you can actually use Master Roshi to generate charge points very quickly every turn. Most Guardians also have some kind of effect in place of an attack. Now, this is still considered that character's technique, it's just not an attack technique because it doesn't have any kind of power value. It has a defend, of course, and now would be a good time to talk about what defend actually does. Some of you may have figured this out already, but defend values actually take away from your opponent's dice roll. So if your opponent, for example, were to attack Master Roshi and you decided to defend, your opponent would take -2 off of whatever they rolled on the dice. You don't get to do anything back to them, of course, but it is an effective way to stall your opponent out and make them waste an attack. This is especially useful on a Guardian character, because if a Guardian character is protecting your life points, then you can use defend values and their own HP to take attacks instead of your Crash Box. One last thing about deck Guardians is you'll notice that some characters actually have the word Guardian among their jobs. This is another rare example of a card's job affecting gameplay, because characters with the job Guardian can be your deck's Guardian just like level 0s can. If, for one reason or another, your character loses the job Guardian, then they have to stop being in your Guardian slot and step back out onto the field. Let's talk about how the game actually works now. You'll have 3 zones to work with. The first zone here is just an out-of-play area for your extra cards to go. Your deck, your discard pile, and the Guardian of your deck will go here. You can put your location in the same spot as your Guardian, or you can put it off to the side, it doesn't matter. Next up is your Summon Zone. The Summon Zone is called the Summon Zone because all of your newly played characters will go here. You can summon a new character to any of the 5 squares, but do keep in mind that the characters will be moving around, so you may want to actually pay attention to where they're played. The Clash Zone is where most of the action will be taking place, and it's also the place where your location clashes with your opponent's location. Characters that you want to go out to battle should be moved to the Clash Zone as soon as possible. Another unique thing about TGC is it's balanced around having a massive number of players, so every single player in the game will have a zone that looks just like this. At the beginning of the game, you'll want to take your Guardian and your location and set them to the side. At this point in the game, your Guardian has to be a level 0, even if you plan on using a different Guardian later in the game. Next, search your deck for one level 1 character and place it in your Summon Zone. All of the starter decks have a main character that is meant to be your starting character, but really the choice is up to you, and there are reasons you wouldn't want to use your deck's main character as your starter. For example, you'll notice that Sonic only has a charge value of 5, so if you wanted to have a bit better late game, you could actually choose to elect somebody else to be your starter who has a higher charge value. In a case like that, Knuckles would be a great choice because he has a charge value of 15, which is 3 times faster than the amount that Sonic can charge for. For this example though, we'll just go with Sonic. The rest of your deck can go here. Draw 5 cards for your opening hand. The mulligan rule for TGC is you can take as many cards as you want from your opening hand, place them on the bottom of your deck, and then draw that many cards. You and all other players roll a dice to see who goes first. And don't forget, 6 is 0. At the beginning of your turn, draw 1 card. You do this even if you're going first. TGC isn't split into phases like other card games, so you have a start of your turn, a turn, and then an end of your turn, and that's it. During your turn, you can do any of the following actions in any order you want. Once per turn, you can summon one character to your side of the field. If you have the next level of a character in play, for example, our level 1 Sonic is in play and we have a level 2 Sonic in our hand, you can pay 100 charge points to level that character up. Each character can do this once, but newly summoned characters cannot do this the turn they're put into play. You start the game with 200 charge points, so 100 charge points at the beginning of the game can be a bit risky. You may want to balance your risk and reward here. Now that Sonic is leveled up into level 2, this creates something called a character stack. Sonic's character stack has two cards in it, the level 1 and the level 2. The character's HP is whatever the highest level's value is, so in this case it's going to be the level 2 Sonic's max HP. But when using an action or when in battle, you can use any of the cards in your character's character stack. In this case, for example, Sonic's Speed Dash, Defend -1, and Charge 5 can all still be used. So leveling up characters isn't just a stat change, it also gives them more options. Each character can tap to add their charge value to your current charge points. This is called charging. You can only do this with one card on each character's character stack and only once per turn. Since we just paid 100 charge points to level up Sonic, let's get some of that back, shall we? First, we'll charge Chao for 25. Next up, we'll charge Amy for 10. And why not? We'll charge level 2 Sonic for another 25. So this turn we've gotten back 60 of the points that we used to level up Sonic, meaning we should have a total of 160 charge points. Next up, each character on the field can move one space. There is a minor caveat to this rule though. A character must have at least one untapped card in their character stack in order to move. The cool thing about this though is it can be any card in the character stack. So if you have an event that you can attach to a character, or if a character has an equip card, they'll pretty much always be able to move. Our Green Hill Zone location card is a bit special in this case, because normally a location effect gives you a once per turn effect, but Green Hill Zone's effect is if one of our Emerald characters, again this is another rare case where our job actually matters, if an Emerald character starts their move in this location, then they can move 2 spaces instead of 1. So we could move Sonic up and to the right, up and to the left, 2 spaces to the right, or however we choose. And there is also something else special about being able to move extra spaces. While characters can move around on your board as much as you want, you can also choose to move them onto your opponent's board. This is useful, because if you move into your opponent's clash zone, then you can reach characters in your opponent's summon zone that normally you wouldn't be able to target, since normally characters can only target characters adjacent to them. So for example, let's say we're fighting against a Dragon Ball Z deck and they choose to move Goku up into our clash zone. They are now adjacent to Amy Rose and can start attacking. This might be useful, because destroying Amy Rose now would not give her a chance to level up. Ultimately, what you'd like to do is move a character to your opponent's summon zone so you can attack their Crash Box directly. Remember, your Crash Box is this game's version of life points, and each player starts with 500. I know Crash Box is a weird name, and I asked about it too because I thought it was pretty weird, but let me explain. Here's the lore behind Crash Boxes. So essentially you have like an electrical box on your side of the field that acts as a power generator for actually bringing your cards out onto the field and keeping your location up. So if the Crash Box gets destroyed, you no longer have power on your side of the field, therefore you cannot continue playing the game. So it is a box that you are trying to crash, because if you can make their box crash, then they can't play the game. And don't worry, I was a bit disappointed when I heard the explanation too. Anyways, another benefit to having a character in your opponent's summon zone is you'll notice that having Goku in our summon zone actually takes up one of our slots and lets us summon one less character. So right now, we can only summon 2 characters to the right of Sonic because Goku is taking up our last spot on our left. Of course, the risk-reward here is the fact that now that Goku is in our territory, we can start fighting him 2v1 using Sonic and Amy, and we could even bring our Guardian into the mix, because another special thing about Guardians is that they're considered adjacent to every space of the summon zone. Number of characters can make a huge difference in this game, so having Goku fight us 3v1 actually gives us a gigantic advantage. So if you're going to invade your opponent's territory, you may want to make sure you're prepared first, have plenty of charge points, and have at least 2 or 3 characters you can bring to the battle. Next up, you can play event cards. Power Ring is a good example of one. Earlier, I said that event cards are you play them once and put them in the discard pile, but there are some events like this one that stay in play. Power Ring attaches to one character and can be used to negate 50 or less damage and then possibly go back to your hand. Now remember, time stops when you use an event card, so you could use this to negate some damage and then immediately play it on a character again. It's pretty cool. And remember when we were talking about character stacks earlier? Well, if we choose to play Power Ring and put it next to Sonic, then our Sonic now has this card in their character stack. This means a couple of cool things for us in the game, but the main thing that it means for us is that if all of the character cards in this character stack, meaning Sonic Level 1 and Sonic Level 2, are tapped, we can still move because we have an event card that is untapped. While we can play as many event cards as we want a turn, and a character can have as many events attached to them as we wish, we cannot have more than one of the same event attached to a character at once. So for example, Sonic is stuck at one Power Ring. He's not getting another one until that one disappears. We could, however, play one on Amy if we had a second one in our hand. Finally, we move on to what is probably the most complex, but also the most important part of the game, the combat. Combat is extremely simple in theory, and players who have played the game for a while seem to understand it pretty well, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to erase everything and just assume that we have a Sonic and Tails in play. Sonic is level 5, Tails is level 3, and our opponent is playing a Zelda deck with a level 5 Link and a level 3 Zelda. We'll assume that somehow the board got to this state, and we will have Link equipped with the Master Sword, and for flavor's sake, we'll have Sonic equipped with the Gallic Gun. I've erased everything else from the board, and we will assume for the sake of this example that there's just no charge points, and we'll just ignore that for right now. Also keep in mind that when a character levels up, they keep all of the cards that are lower in the character stack, but I'm just too lazy to animate 20 cards at the same time. You'll have to forgive me. So let's say, for the sake of example, that it is our turn and we would like to go into combat. We're going to go into combat with Sonic's level 2 attack, Rush. Our target for the attack will be Link. Now we have initiated combat between Sonic and Link, and they are both now known as involved in battle. For the most part, this doesn't mean anything, but Zelda and Tails are not yet involved in the battle because nothing has affected them yet. So, since the battle has just begun, we need to make a special roll known as an initiative roll. The player who has initiative is going to be in a special position, because they will be choosing what cards will go against their opponent's cards first. So even though it is our turn, if we lose the initiative roll, then Link will be the one who chooses their combat cards before we do. For the first match, initiative doesn't really matter, because we've already declared what the first attack will be. It'll be Rush, and the target will be Link. If we win the initiative roll, then after this battle, we'll choose what card to attack with next, and then so on and so forth. Battles will continue with us choosing our attacks first, and our opponent reacting to them. Some of you may have noticed that the player who has initiative seems to be at a disadvantage. Since they're the ones choosing their cards first, your opponent can choose whatever is the best card in that situation to react with. However, there is one special reason that you would want initiative, and that's known as Escape. The player who has initiative has access to a move called Escape, which means that they can tap one card in their character stack. Again, it can be any card, whether it's an event, equip, or lower character card, and just immediately end the battle instead of clashing. Of course, if the player with initiative has already chosen a card to attack with, they can't do this, but they can do this as their action. So if our opponent's Link does win the initiative roll, then they can choose to just dodge our attack by tapping one card in their character stack, like their level 1 or their equip card. For this initiative roll, we'll say that our opponent rolled a 2 and we rolled a 4, meaning that we win initiative. Since our opponent doesn't have initiative, they can't choose to escape battle, so they have to choose some kind of action to clash against our attack. This is where things can get a little bit complicated on the surface, but once you understand what's going on, it gets a bit easier. Even though Link is the target of our attack, Link and Zelda are both adjacent to Sonic, meaning the Zelda player can actually choose a card on Zelda's character stack to clash with, making Zelda a part of the battle as well. This is one way that characters not involved in battle can become involved in battle. Our opponent chooses to counter with Jump Slash. Now that both sides have chosen their clash techniques, we will roll for critical. Our critical will be 4 and our opponent's critical will be 1. Our power is 80 and Link's power is 30. That means we win the clash with 50 damage to be applied. Now this is where we hit our second complication, so pay attention. Right now there's 50 damage that needs to be applied to Link's team. I say team because another element of this game is that if a character is adjacent to another character that is about to deal damage, they can choose to take some of the damage for themselves. In layman's terms, since Zelda is also adjacent to Sonic, Zelda can take some of the damage for Link. This can be very useful for keeping low HP characters alive, and also useful for redirecting damage to a tanky character, or a character that has a lot of health, or can heal. In this case, just to make it easy, we'll say that Zelda and Link split the damage evenly, and both take 25. As I said before, the game deals in multiples of 5, so this is no exception. You have to deal the damage in multiples of 5. You can't have one character take like 21 damage and the other character take 29. They both take a nice even 25 and we move on. Since Zelda has now taken damage in this battle, Zelda is now involved in battle. Don't overcomplicate the idea of a character being involved in battle. It really doesn't change anything, and it was probably bound to happen anyway because the characters are so close to each other. Now the next clash can begin. The Sonic player still has initiative. Sonic can either choose another attack, preemptively use a defense technique, use an equip card, or we could pass it over to Tails, who is also in range of one of the characters currently in battle. For the sake of showing this off, we're gonna have Tails use an attack. Notice for a second that Zelda is not close enough to Tails to actually do anything. So for this clash, Zelda cannot take an action unless she somehow gets a ranged attack. In this case, Link is going to have to choose a card to clash with. Link uses this as an opportunity to start setting up his Master Sword. So Link is now clashing against Tails' Sky attack of times 25 with its own cut of times 20 because you have to start at the top. We are not so lucky this time. We roll a 1 and our opponent rolls a 3, meaning it will be 25 against 60. That means we lose the clash with 35 damage to be assigned. Now just like before, the damage source is coming from Link, and both Sonic and Tails are adjacent to Link, so either of them could split the damage. In this case, we'll have Tails take all of the damage because we have a special trick up our sleeve. Remember earlier when I said that you could stop time to use an event card? Well, we'll attach Power Ring to Tails before the damage is applied, and then we can discard it to negate the 35 damage. In this case, we'll say that our bad luck continues and we do not succeed in the roll that would put it back in our hands. Sonic's team still has initiative, so we have to decide what to do next. We'll just have Tails use up his other attack, the Tails Dance. Now our opponent has a choice. They've already started using the Master Sword. They can either continue the Master Sword combo going into Slash, or they can choose to stop this combo, let the rest of the attacks on Master Sword go to waste, and go into something else. Trying to predict when your opponent is going to stop a combo and switch gears into something else is part of the strategy. For the sake of argument, we'll just say your opponent goes into Slash. Whoa, looks like our luck is back in full force. We roll a 5 and our opponent rolls a 0. That gives us a total of 50 damage against our opponent's whopping 0, and unfortunately the Zelda deck doesn't have power rings. Now Team Zelda needs to assign 50 damage. You may be thinking, well that's no problem, we'll just have Zelda take 25 and Link take 25 like we did last time, but this time it's not quite so simple. Look at who's dealing the damage right now. It's Tails. Only someone adjacent to the character who's dealing the damage can take some of the damage. So Zelda is unfortunately a bit too far away to actually take any damage that Tails deals. In a case like this, we have to assign all of the damage to Link. And that's a basic rundown of the combat. Things would go like this until Sonic decided to pass initiative over to Link. You might want to do this if you're running low on charge points, or if you're running low on cards that you want to attack with, or if you just want your opponent to be the one to have to choose their attacks first. Keep in mind that at the end of your turn, your opponent will get to take their turn, meaning all of their cards will untap, they'll get to attack you back, and you'll have so many tapped cards on you that you'll have less chances to defend yourself. So it's usually pretty wise to keep some cards untapped in battle, unless you know for a fact you can attack and kill some of your opponent's characters. Even though those are the basics, there are some smaller, less defined rules that we have to talk about. Firstly, if damage from a character would destroy another character, then that character can level up this turn once for free. If you're the turn player, then this counts as your level up for the turn, and you cannot level up a second time. Though if it's your opponent's turn when this happens, you can still do it, but you cannot level up this way again. Meaning that you can use this to actually level up on your opponent's turn, which is pretty cool. Next is how range characters work. Let's say our opponent moves Gohan into our summon zone and then declares an attack on Inuyasha. Initiative happens, Gohan wins, and Inuyasha cannot run from the fight. Under normal circumstances, Inuyasha needs to select an attack to clash back with. However, Kagome has an attack with +1 range, meaning that even though Kagome is not adjacent to Gohan, she can still clash back with this one specific attack because it has enough range to clash back. She's now involved in battle, but cannot do much else unless she finds a way to either get closer or get another ranged attack. Another small detail is that if your opponent is attacking with an attack technique and you choose to defend with a non-attack technique, then the effect still goes through, but the attack is essentially uncontested. This makes it extremely dangerous to use non-combat techniques in the middle of a battle. If it were the Tails player's turn, they could just use Genius Mind and use its effect, have that be that. But if Link and Tails are currently in a fight, and Link uses Jump Slash and Tails responds with Genius Mind, then that is Tails' action for the clash. Genius Mind's effect would go off, but they would take the full damage from Jump Slash. I know we've gone over a lot, and this combat thing seems like it's pretty crazy, but there is one more thing we have to talk about. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that a character died, and there's 150 damage left that they couldn't take. What happens to the damage? As you probably guessed, since the Crash Box acts like life points in Yu-Gi-Oh!, any damage that cannot be assigned to characters in battle because they have been destroyed before all of the damage is applied is dealt directly to the Crash Box. Under normal circumstances, the player who had their character lost would just lose 150 from their Crash Box, and since it starts at 500, they would go down to 350. But this is finally where we get to talk about Guardians and what they actually do. Guardians are the last line of defense for your Crash Box, so they can choose to either respond to your opponent's shockwave damage, in this case 150, by either using an attack technique to beat that 150, using a defense technique to lower the damage of that 150, or to simply take the damage themselves. Just like in a team battle, you can choose to split the assigned damage between your Chao and your Crash Box. Since your Crash Box is so vital, it's very, very common to just have your Guardian take all of the damage. Also keep in mind that if you stop having a Guardian for whatever reason at any point, then your Crash Box is defenseless, and it's very easy to destroy. I hope I did a pretty good job of explaining all of that. Trust me, I was pretty lost the first time too, but if you really think about it, everything makes sense. It's just so needlessly complicated that it can seem like too much is going on at once. I found that the players I got to play with actually got used to the rules very quickly though, so if hypothetically you were ever to play this game, it would come very naturally, I promise. Now, there's one final rule to talk about, and that's what happens at the end of your turn. At the end of your turn, you can choose to kick any cards you want to out of your hand and return them to the deck. Start by placing them on the bottom of your deck, then drawing the same number of cards. This can be done every single turn with no penalty, so it's recommended you do this as often as possible. Once you're done, shuffle your deck. Another unique thing about this mechanic is it can be done at the end of each of your opponent's turns in a multiplayer match, as long as you're not the player going next. I'll explain. So let's say you're in a match with 2 other players. Now at the end of your turn, you can choose to reload. At the end of the next player's turn, they can also choose to reload, and you can choose to reload with them, because you are not the player going next. Now, once the third player takes their turn and ends their turn and does their reload, you cannot choose to reload because you are the player going next. Basically, in a multiplayer match, you can do it on every player's turn except for the turn that would lead back into yours. Now, there are some other rules that I could talk about, but the game is far, far, far long gone. There's really no reason to get too much into the details of the game because chances are you'll never be playing it. However, if you are curious about the game, feel free to go to the link in the description, and the full card lists for all of the available cards are on there. And if you're an absolute madman, you can have these printed out on index cards or something similar and actually play a few games yourself using proxy decks. Index cards are how I experienced the game, and from what I heard, they're how the creator distributed the cards when they were younger too. And if you're looking for a unique card game experience, then I highly recommend it. In fact, I'd actually like to go into a bit of depth with each of these sets and talk about what makes this card game so special. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if this video for some reason picks up a lot of traction and you guys want me to go more in-depth with the starter decks to this game, or some set reviews or something, then I'd be more than happy to. Leave the thoughts in the comment section below. The Zelda deck was an extremely forgiving deck meant to initiate new players. Link himself was extremely powerful, and there was a lot of healing that went on in the deck as well. The deck also sported 3 level 5s, which made it pretty powerful, especially considering that 2 of the level 5s, Link and Zelda, included a triple roll on their level 5 attack. As you can probably guess, triple roll meant that your critical roll was actually 3 dice instead of 1, making them incredibly powerful. There was also a really fun character in Saria, who didn't really contribute to battle at all, but had some interesting and unique effects outside of battles. If you were playing a straight Zelda deck, the deck also had some very powerful event cards, as you can probably imagine. Most of them were limited due to how useful they were. One that everybody seemed very keen to use was Soul Intervention, which allowed you to combine 2 attacks into 1, dealing 1 incredibly devastating blow. Any newer player could pick up this deck and have a pretty good time with the game. The Sonic deck doesn't seem to have any fancy tricks. It doesn't have very good equip cards, it's got 1 or 2 really useful events but not too much. Its main power comes from the fact that there are 6 characters in the deck and all of them serve a very unique function. Sonic is of course your main attacker, and when you get into level 5, he deals a lot of damage due to Hypersonic Light hitting all characters. Keep in mind that each character has to defend against this attack separately, so you can really rack up the damage that your opponent has to apply. Tails had a 0 damage defensibility in Fly that was pretty cheap for what it did. 0 damage defense abilities mean that no matter what your opponent rolls, it automatically negates all damage, and you can also counter with Sky Attack, meaning that even though this is only 1 card, you can use both its defense technique and its attack technique in one battle. This made Tails a really good defensive unit because you could move Tails in front of another character or in battle with another character and just eat 1 attack and deal some damage back. Knuckles is pretty much what you expect. His attacks are a little bit expensive, but he's got pretty decent charge for who he is, and he deals a lot of damage, and that is really his only value, is dealing a lot of damage. Not much utility. Amy was a neat attachment character to Sonic because she had a move that pretty much let her teleport to wherever Sonic was and join a battle, and she was great for comebacks because her Angered Swing builds up damage the more you lose in combat. So if you are losing, you just teleport Amy straight into the battle and one-shot a character, and that's her role. For whatever reason, the Sonic starter deck is based on the Sonic Adventure DX lineup, so the next character we have is Big the Cat. Not a battle character at all, straight utility, but pretty decent utility, because you could use him to look at cards from your deck and then draw those cards, and it was pretty useful. And Gamma, of course, was your ranged attacker. To be completely honest, he wasn't that useful from what I saw. He was cool for what he was, but he was mainly just for taking pot shots at character in your opponent's summon zone that were just trying to sit back and charge, or taking some pot shots at your opponent's crash box by standing in your clash zone. It's fine for what it is, but not that useful. The DBZ deck was built mainly around equips and cheap attacks. You could really rack up the damage with a DBZ deck fast because you could just draw a bunch of great equips, equip one character, and then shove them into your opponent's zone and see what they do. You would run out of charge points very quickly, but it would also be very funny. The signature card of the deck was, of course, Spirit Bomb, which is a very unique card because you could have your characters charge not towards your charge points, but rather to charge towards Spirit Bomb's power and then unleash one huge devastating attack. Now, if your opponent had somebody with a 0 damage defense ability, you might not want to do this, but it is still pretty neat. The Kamehameha is also extremely signature, of course. When using the attack, you can pay for the attack up to 4 more times, essentially, because you can pay 30 CP in a multiple of 4 to add extra dice to this attack. So you could essentially have 5 dice when you roll this card's critical, if you're willing, of course, to pay the 145 it would cost. Honestly, the character cards themselves aren't that unique outside of, like, Gohan, because Gohan has the Father-Son Kamehameha, which gets stronger if Goku is dead. And arguably the most useful location. Seriously, everybody I saw playing would use this. Seeing Mega Man EXE among the lineup actually made me quite excited because I liked the Mega Man Battle Network games quite a lot, and the deck itself is pretty unique for what it does. Most decks contain at least 4 characters, but in the case of Mega Man there's only 2. There's Mega Man himself and Lan Hikari. In fact, the entire purpose of the deck is to give Mega Man a bunch of bonuses for being the only one in battle, and then completely overwhelm multiple opponents at once. Due to the limited number of characters in the deck, coming up to only 10, there are a lot of very, very powerful attachments you could give to Mega Man that do not count as equip cards, like this card for example. Mega Man just gets a times 100 attack at any level. This one gives him some range. This one is completely busted, and this one makes Mega Man an actual god. Outside of that, there were events like One Step Ahead that allowed you to gain the same charge points one of your opponent's characters would get from charging a character, but only when that opponent had more characters in play than you, which made it perfect for a Mega Man deck. Battle Routine Set lets you charge without tapping as long as you had less characters in play. This one lets you just straight up reboot all of Mega Man's cards, so honestly, the deck itself is pretty interesting and unique, but keep in mind that if you've only got one character in play, it's pretty easy for your opponent to just run straight past them into your Crash Box, so the deck wasn't broken by any means. The deck also included the first Arduous card. The Arduous series was a series of cards that allowed one player to essentially make a gamble on whether they were going to win or lose. It was essentially, if I'm losing the game, I'm going to play an Arduous card, and if I win, I win. If I lose, then that's just it for me. Now, the Arduous Battle Finds Closure was the one that came out in the first set, though in future sets there were other Arduous cards that came out to follow the same theme. They would be cards that gave you a huge advantage or made it so you and your opponent played some kind of mini-game, and the winner essentially won the duel because they had such a huge advantage, and if you didn't pull off whatever the card said, then you immediately lost. In the case of Arduous Battle Finds Closure, you have to knock another player out of the game by the end of the turn. If you can't do it, then you're the player who's knocked out of the game. Like I said before, Lan was also a part of the deck, but Lan's entire job was to make Mega Man more powerful, and at some point you actually wanted to sack Lan off because you wanted to pull off Mega Man's Dark Transformation, so he wasn't that important, but if you did have him in play, it was pretty useful because he was another body that could body block your opponent's characters that were trying to rush you down to get to your Crash Box. The last of the Premier set decks was Inuyasha. From what I hear, Inuyasha wasn't a part of the main lineup and got added later through some kind of voting system, but not too sure. Inuyasha's deck has a pretty unique gimmick too, in that Inuyasha and Kagome are meant to be on one team on one side of the map, and Miroku and Sango are meant to be on a second team on another side of the map. So essentially, you would team up Inuyasha and Kagome and send them to another player's area and start wreaking havoc, and then keep Sango and Miroku in your own area to start sort of defending your Crash Box a little bit. Or you could send them to yet another player's area and start wreaking havoc over there. Essentially, the entire point was to keep Inuyasha and Kagome together and Sango and Miroku together because they worked really well as two-man squads. Inuyasha was brute force, as you can imagine. Kagome supported him with ranged attacks. Miroku was an interesting character who could literally eat cards off of your opponent's character stack to make them weaker. And when they were weaker, Sango would come in and one-shot them. The only other really memorable thing about the deck is that it has Clash of the Titans in it, which seemed like a really funny card. Essentially, you would create a 1v1 scenario between one of your characters and one of your opponent's characters, and you would both get a crap ton of charge points to initiate just one huge beefy battle. Interesting idea. Didn't see it used a whole lot, but it was interesting. Again, if you're more interested in the decks and you want to see me cover more about this game and these decks in general, then I'm more than happy to leave in the comment section below. I'm kind of just going over highlights right now because I want to get through as much of this as I can without this being a 5-hour video. After many reboots of the same 5 decks, there was eventually a Season 2 released of the starter decks that we can also look at as well. After over 10 years, the game finally saw another set of starter decks in the form of 5 new spiritual successors to the original decks. They weren't true successors, as they all seem to split off and do their own thing, but they are interesting enough that I can talk about them. After the game had been out for so long, the creator realized that the matches were taking a bit too long. Players were sitting back and charging continuously because, simply put, the attacks in the game just cost way too much charge. So, what he did is he went back and he scaled back the cost of everything in the game so that hopefully the action would start a little bit sooner. It was a good move in my opinion because length of the games was probably the most common complaint that I heard about it, and we'll get into that a bit more later. I want to talk about these new decks and what they did first. Rurouni Kenshin was the first of the decks that I got to see, and you know that I'm down for some Rurouni Kenshin, so I was very excited to see this deck. The deck's gimmick is it essentially tried to win without destroying any of your opponent's characters. Now, this is of course where we start to see some of the gimmicks set in. Kenshin himself cannot actually destroy another character. He can only deal shockwave damage and then leave the character incapacitated. And essentially, they never die, so they can attack you back. But to counterbalance this, Kenshin is extremely powerful for an extremely cheap cost. He's a very hard character to take down in a 1v1. It's just he cannot kill you, you know? He can't destroy your character. The trick, though, is the entire reason he can't destroy another character is because there's an effect on his level 1 that stops him from doing so. So, if you're in the heat of battle and you do want to destroy a character, you can actually play this card to remove the level 1 from the character stack, also removing the limitation that Kenshin cannot destroy another character. However, if you do end up destroying a character after this, Kenshin essentially disappears from the field and you have to re-level him up. Most of the other characters would have some kind of Kamiya Kashin effect, which essentially means if you don't have initiative or if you're in some kind of disadvantage, you gain some kind of advantage out of it. So if you were losing, you got something to compensate for the fact that you were losing, and if you were winning, well, you didn't really need the effect anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Last notable thing about the deck is this one card that let all of your opponents choose whether or not they got a bunch of charge points or drew cards, and you could essentially profit off of each opponent that did this. So if you were in a multiplayer match with like 5 other players, and each of the other players chooses to gain like 100 charge points, like 3 of them choose to gain 100 charge points and 2 of them choose to draw, then you get to gain 300 charge points and draw 2 cards off of it. It's pretty unique. The Hellsing starter deck was a very clear sequel to the Mega Man starter deck, in that the entire point of the deck is just to have Alucard one-man army your opponent's entire field. When I said earlier that Kenshin was hard to kill, it's absolutely nothing compared to what Alucard can do to you, and it's even worse in Alucard's case because a lot of his attacks are ranged, and he has a very special gimmick. At some point in the game, you can just say screw it and completely change all of the rules by playing this card here. So here's how it works. Alucard becomes your Crash Box. So your opponent can't just run up and attack your Crash Box anymore. They have to find a way to kill Alucard. Alucard himself becomes so powerful that you can't really destroy all of his HP anymore. It seems possible, but it's very unlikely. And what you have to do is you have to beat him in a bunch of clashes. Every time you beat him in a clash, he loses points. And if you build up all of the points required to actually defeat him completely, then you win the game. It's an extremely fun boss mode where you and other players can team up against the Alucard player, and the funny thing is, even if it's like 2 or 3 of you teaming up against him, there's still a chance he's gonna beat you just because he's so powerful. Just like Lan was a part of the Mega Man strategy, Ceres is a part of the Alucard strategy. She is a pretty powerful character on her own, I'm not gonna lie, but at some point your goal is to kill her off, so that Alucard gets big and beefy and just sort of eats your opponent's characters. It's difficult to talk about the Hellsing deck without talking about the fear levels. Each of the fear levels essentially makes every player switch every single card in one of their areas with another one, and this can be used in very fun strategic ways. You have ones that move all of the cards from your opponent's deck to their discard pile, and then switch their discard pile out with their deck, and then switch their hand out with their deck, and then switch their deck out with their discard pile, and then switch that out with your hand. It gets pretty nuts. The Brave Fencer Musashi deck is reasonably normal when compared to the other decks we're going to look at after this. Essentially, you have both Musashis, Brave Fencer and Samurai Legend, and they're both pretty powerful on their own, but their gimmick is that they rely on winning and losing clashes to keep up some kind of other effect. Brave Fencer Musashi gained hero coins every time you won a clash. Samurai Legend Musashi gained them every time you lost a clash. And then you could spend them all on this card here, Heroic Destiny, to get some kind of effect depending on how many coins you were willing to spend. So the entire point of the deck was to just constantly stay in battle. Even if you weren't doing very much damage, you always wanted to be in battle so you could just continuously spend points and get these effects. As if that's not enough, there are 2 other gimmicks within the deck. The first is that both Brave Fencer Musashi and Samurai Legend Musashi can steal attacks from your opponent's tapped cards. This is extremely cool, because if your opponent is using some kind of equip combo, then you could just steal whatever the strongest attack is on that card and then use it against them. The other gimmick is that the deck is filled with a bunch of level 1 characters, who can all summon a special equip card from the deck, or if that equip card is already in play, they give some kind of special bonus to the Musashi that's currently using that equip card. For example, if you've got the Fire Maiden out and you don't have the Fire Sword out, then you can use her to get the Fire Sword, and if you already have the Fire Sword out, then the Fire Sword was just a lot better in battle. Overall, the deck's no slouch, but you do have to keep in mind that through all of this, you've got to find a way to keep your charge points up, and if you're just constantly in battle, you're probably going to run out of steam way faster than your opponent will. And you've only got 2 real characters. The rest of them are just these little level 1 characters that your opponent's going to tear through very quickly. So the deck requires you to be reckless, but at the same time also asks you not to be reckless because your opponent can just run past you and win the duel. Resident Evil. I don't even know where to begin with Resident Evil. Resident Evil has such a weird gameplay mechanic. So here's how it works, right? You essentially get effects that let you take cards and put them face down on the field as zombie tokens, and then the zombie tokens can move to your opponent's area and swarm them essentially. The zombie tokens can also stack on top of each other to create a zombie stack, which essentially works like a character stack. The basic zombies don't do a whole lot, they can just bite for a ×10 attack, but the special thing about them is if they happen to deal damage to a character, like if a character gets unlucky and rolls a 0, or if you attack a tapped character, then you can poison cards in their character stack to stop them from untapping for a turn. So like 1 or 2 of these, it's really not a big deal, but when your opponent finds a way to get like 8 or 9 of these on the board, oh my gosh, it is an absolute nightmare, and you don't actually deal shockwave damage from killing them, so there's really no downside. The thing that makes the deck really interesting, though, is the characters in your own deck are meant to actually farm the zombies to get effects. So, essentially, the flavor of the deck is you've got Wesker in the back creating a bunch of zombie tokens, and then you have Jill and Chris killing the zombie tokens to get effects, while the zombie tokens also swarm your opponent. It's really fascinating. I didn't see this deck do too well in a lot of its matches, but I feel like if it were in the right hands, it could probably stomp a lot of other players just because of how unpredictable it is. You really have to balance the whole sending zombies to your opponent thing versus killing the zombies yourself to farm them for items and extra CP and stuff. But wait, there's more. Some of the zombie tokens aren't regular zombies. Some of the zombie tokens are actually face-down specially infected zombies that can flip face-up under certain circumstances. And the thing is, your opponent doesn't know which ones are going to be regular zombies and which ones are going to be these specially infected zombies that can actually beat them in fights until after they start fighting them. So yeah, overall just a very strange little gimmick to have, but it is pretty fun sort of watching your Wesker set up a bunch of zombies and then attacking through with Jill and Chris, and at some point you can actually use Wesker to kill off Jill and Chris and turn them into a bunch of zombie tokens as well. So if that's your thing, man, it's a really, really great time. Finally, the absolute weirdest deck in the entire game is the Death Note deck. Here's how the Death Note deck works. You keep a separate sheet of paper next to you, normally multiple sheets of paper because of a mechanic that I'll talk about here in a second, and then there's a note mechanic that the deck has. So there are two different types of notes. There are targets, which are either card names or characters on the field, and then there are effect notes, which you can essentially write after characters and card names that are already in your notes, or you can set them up and then set up the character names later. So every time you use an effect that lets you add something to your note, you can either put it on its own separate line as sort of half of a note, or you can attach it to another note of the opposite kind. So let's say you already have an effect written down in your note, and you use something that lets you add a character name or a card name to your note. You can either attach the two together for some kind of effect, or you can put them on separate lines to prepare them for later. The effects will almost always have some kind of trigger effect, like when a character tries to move, or when a character equips something, or plays an event card. And you can take those and then show them to your opponent and then show them what's going to happen and then essentially control the board. It's probably the closest the game has to a true control deck. But again, it's a very different experience from the rest of the decks that you see here. The Death Note characters themselves have pretty much no battles whatsoever. They can't fight at all. Their entire gimmick is to keep the opponent away while they set up a board wipe, and then after they board wipe, they have a special mechanic in play that they can use to just outright win the game. There are 3 different characters that the deck focuses around, and each one focuses on a card type. Kira himself, Light Yagami, he deals with taking care of character cards. Misa screws with your opponent's deck and stops them from playing event cards. And Teru destroys your opponent's equip cards. An example of a note would be this. You have Buying Time, which lets you add the phrase, discards 1 card from their owner's hand whenever it initiates an attack. Not the exact effect text, but I'm paraphrasing. And this on its own would just be an effect note. In order for it to fully take effect, we would then have to add some kind of name to it. Level 1 Light Yagami, for example, can just add a character name. So, for example, if you're fighting against a Sonic deck, you could just add Sonic's name to the Death Note along with Buying Time. And then when your opponent starts attacking, you reveal the note. And if your opponent really wants to keep attacking with Sonic, then they have to discard their entire hand, essentially. And it's essentially just controlling your opponent's board with effects like this until you can get off a bunch of checkmates to start destroying your opponent's characters using your Death Note. And after that, you get your own special win condition. Your opponent has a chance to put a character from their hand or deck into play. If they can't, then they get one final turn to try and make something happen. If they still cannot get a character on board by the end of their final turn, then you're declared the winner of the game. If you lose the card at any point, then you can take it and put it back in your hand by paying some charge. Okay, so I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but we're about an hour or so into recording, so I'm just going to end the actual deck discussion there because there are still a lot of things I want to talk about outside of that. Since I was able to sit down and talk with the creator, I have a lot of interesting insight here that I think will help some people who are working on their own card games or people who are looking for something fun and unique to play that don't really know what they're looking for. And again, if you are interested in any of these decks, then you can just go to the website in the description and check out the full deck lists for yourself. Or, of course, leave a comment in the comment section below saying that you want more of this game, and I will be more than happy to cover some of it for you. I'm sure the creator would really like that as well. Even though the set numbers seem kind of sparse for a game that was around for 15 years, keep in mind that the game kept getting rebooted, and there were some more sets that were created and planned and then either didn't happen or were destroyed. At some point in the game's lifespan, Naruto had a set because of course it did. Essentially, the gimmick to the Naruto set is you could use hand seals to make your jutsu equip cards a lot stronger, or you could choose to skip them to use really weak attacks. So essentially, it was about charging up big attacks, and that was pretty much it. Full Metal Alchemist also got a set at one point. Its entire gimmick was about switching cards between your deck and your discard pile, or your deck and your hand. So essentially, it was all about controlling what was in your hand. Not super powerful in combat, but extremely consistent, and had some pretty decent control options, I think. A Higurashi set was planned but never created or released, which essentially worked around a paranoia gimmick. The way it worked is you could essentially change what the effect text on some of your opponent's cards said. You could force them to activate events that they didn't want to activate and miss their timing. You could make them stop from leveling up. You could change around the cards in their hand with cards in their deck so that they never knew what they were playing. Essentially, it was just about making your opponent really salty and not really about winning the game through battle. I guess the closest thing the game ended up getting was Death Note, but it doesn't sound like it was totally the same. I am kind of curious to see what would have happened if Higurashi had become a set. And finally, we talk about The World Ends With You. The World Ends With You was the most recent set to actually get cards in the game, and interestingly enough, we still have some of the cards around. The creator said that he sort of lost all of the image files at some point, but managed to get a lot of them uploaded onto the website, so we can at least take a look at what about half of the set was like, so let's take a look. The gimmick of the World Ends With You set is you could use cards to take cards from your deck and put them into a separate pile called an entrance fee pile. And then you could play some mini games with yourself to see if you can get enough task counters to put those cards into your hand. So essentially, if you were really good at playing the deck and managing your task counters, you could control what was going into your hand every single time and play probably the most consistent deck out of any deck in the game. If you need a level 5 Neku, then you just put level 5 Neku in your entrance fee pile, you play some kind of card that gives you task counters, and then you put that card in your hand and you'll level up. That's how it works. Something that I will fully admit I am very, very impressed with is somehow the creator of the game managed to get all of the characters' gimmicks from the game into the card game in a pretty interesting way. Shiki's gimmick of pushing the D-pad up, down, left, and right got in because depending on what move you ended with, once you got your level 4 and had access to all 4 directions, you could choose which move to end with and you would get some kind of huge effect off of it. For example, with this card, if left is the last move you use in the sequence, then your Crash Box gets 100 extra points. All of Beat's cards would give you some kind of token that represented a suit, so you could get Hearts tokens, Diamonds tokens, Clubs tokens, and Spade tokens, and then you could either spend those effects on the level 1 effect that you see here, or you could save them up and then spend one of each token to use his final attack, which did a bunch of damage. Joshua's effects were all the digital odds, so basically the way it worked is you called a number, and then you roll the dice to see if the number was going to be high or low, or so on and so forth. Evens or odds, I think, is also one. And if you get it right, then you get a huge, beefy effect, and if you get it wrong, then nothing happens. Essentially, all of his attacks are really weak and kind of worthless until you actually start getting his digital odds right, so it's a gamble. You either get a really, really nice attack or you get a really crappy attack. It's all up to you. The set also used to have a very important card called the Player Pact, which was pretty much essential for playing the deck, and I actually asked where it was, and apparently it's not one of the cards that made it through, which is unfortunate because it's one of the most essential cards for the entire deck. So the fact that it doesn't exist anymore is really depressing and probably makes the deck very, very difficult to play nowadays. The deck also had 2 secret rares, which seemed to make it through the process, so I'm really glad those were salvaged, but they're cards that probably couldn't actually be used. This first one is, of course, Sho Minamimoto in his noise form, and it's really good. I'm not gonna lie, it's a pretty fantastic card. However, it pales in comparison to our boy, the Game Composer. Jesus Christ, dude. This card was... I don't even see how this card got made. It's so ridiculous. Every time one of your opponents is going to draw a card, they don't draw a card, and instead you look through their deck for a card and put it in their hand. So not only do you get to always know what every card in your opponent's decks are, but you also get to choose what cards they're getting in their hands to make sure they're always getting the worst possible cards. It's so bad. I seriously don't even know how this card got through, especially because it's a level 0, so it can be your guardian. Pretty bad, but whatever, I suppose. Something I'm devastated that I can't look more into is apparently the players were one half of the set, and you could build a deck around the players and just play the same way that you would play a normal deck, but of course around the entrance fee idea. And the other half of the set part that we don't have, was about the Game Masters. So the way the Game Masters would work, apparently, is they were all level 1 characters, but they all had events attached to them that you could play to make your opponent's turns very, very difficult, essentially. So you would play cards that would put your opponent under certain effects, and if your opponent could play through the effects, then they were fine, but if they couldn't play through the effects, then it was essentially like a control deck, where you would control what your opponent could do, you would send cards back to their hand, you would control how much charge they had at any point, you would control all these things about them, and eventually you would win through not battling, which I'm very interested to see, but just, it's lost. It's lost to time, so we'll just never know how that was supposed to play out. Whew, okay, you've all been with me for over an hour now, and we've just been looking at these cards from a completely dead game that's probably never coming back, so thank you all so much for joining me here, but we do need to start wrapping this up, and I would like to start wrapping it up by actually reviewing the game. Well, I mean, what can I say, really? The game is extremely interesting. It's got a lot of mechanics that I think make for a really fun time. I love the way the battle system works, let me just say right off the bat. The other stuff is a little bit iffy. I don't know if I'm really a fan of the way that the grid works. I think it makes the game a little bit too complicated. I think the idea of characters being involved in battle and not being involved in battle and team attacks, so on and so forth, I think all of that stuff could be stripped away for this game to be simplified and made a little bit easier to digest for newer players. Game length was also a huge issue that I saw. Like, a lot of the games I was involved in lasted 2 to 3 hours, and 2 to 3 hours on a card game just is no me gusta. So there should be a way to get rid of such a harsh early game where players are sitting back and being very defensive and not actually initiating any kind of gameplay. Once gameplay starts and the ball gets rolling, the game is super fun to play, and it's a lot of fun to watch. It's just so slow. From what I hear, this game used to be pretty popular when the creator was younger, which, I mean, more power to them, I guess. I guess they, that's sort of the days where they didn't have as many good video games or something, because I can't imagine anybody these days actually sitting down and playing a card game for 3 hours. I think the creator was just a little bit too ambitious for the time. You know what I mean? Like, one of the things that I heard, the stories that he would tell us, is that there were tournaments that they used to play that would seriously last all day. They would start somewhere between like 11 and noon, and then they would just keep going until like 8 o'clock at night on one tournament where there was some kind of gimmick. I think one of the tournaments he said was like chess themed, and he made chess piece cards essentially. And he had them move just like chess pieces on a chessboard. And if you did really well in that tournament, then you got to keep some of the chess pieces, which is a really cool idea because that essentially gives you cards that actually are exclusive to you. Like if you were there for the chess tournament and you got one of the chess pieces, you could add it to your deck, and then nobody else got that card. It was an actual exclusive card that only you would ever have. But the problem, obviously, is that the tournament had to last 7 to 8 hours. That's ridiculous. That's a flaw with the game. There's no way talking around it. That is definitely a flaw with the way the game plays. And I think a lot of it has to do with players naturally being very defensive and not wanting to initiate with each other, and the fact that you're essentially just playing solitaire until somebody decides to start attacking is a problem. If I were going to go back and do this game, I think what I would do personally is I would just go all the way with the uniqueness of the game and just focus mainly on the battle segment. So here's what I would do. Firstly, instead of just having a deck of cards with all of your levels in it, by the way, the leveling system is kind of a problem too, because if one player gets their levels and the other one doesn't, then the game's already so luck dependent, you don't want to also throw in the fact that you'll never get to draw your levels. But anyway, if I were going to go back and do this, I think I would just get rid of the idea of the deck altogether and change it in some way to make it more unique. Like maybe instead of having the deck, each player could just agree on some kind of points value, or there could just be a universal points value, and then characters and equip cards counted towards that points value, and you just started with all of them in play. So like if you wanted to use a level 5 Link, then that character would take up 5 of your points, and let's say each team had like 20 points to work with. So Link would take up 5 of your points, and then if you wanted to have him equipped with a Master Sword, equips could maybe take like 3 points. So you have Link, and then you have like a Master Sword, and then maybe you want to equip like a Kamehameha or something, so you've got the Kamehameha equipped as well. And then that's 12 points, so then you could maybe put in like another level 5 character, and then a level 3 character to round yourself up. And then they all just start on the field. You don't have to worry about drawing them, you don't have to worry about wasting like 6 to 7 turns setting up your field. Your field is set up, and from the very first turn of the game, you can just initiate combat. I think that is the best way that the game could have been handled. Sure, in the game's current state, a bunch of stuff would have had to have been changed for that to happen, and I understand that the creator was young when they made this, so I'm not trying to be too hard on them, but I'm just saying that from an objective standpoint, that needs to be changed, or rather, because the game is defunct now, that needed to be changed in order for the game to actually succeed. Another thing, of course, is the grid. I feel like it makes things a little bit too complicated, so what I think I would change about it is I don't think I would let players move outside of their grid onto somebody else's grid. You know what I mean? Since we have an area called the Clash Zone, and since battles are called clashes, I think the way I would have it work is characters in the Clash Zone are in battle, and characters in the Summon Zone are not in battle. And then you could have ranged characters who can attack from the Summon Zone, but mainly the battles would be held from characters in the Clash Zone. I think phases would have helped a lot here too. Like maybe you go through your main phase, and then when you start your battle phase, everybody in your Clash Zone could fight against characters in your opponent's Clash Zone. And then maybe there could be something where, like, if your opponent doesn't have any characters in the Clash Zone, you could start attacking them directly. I don't know. We would have to work through the niggles of that, but I think, I just think the whole moving around thing makes the game more complicated than it needs to be. Something that I love about the game, and something that I don't think I praised quite enough, is that each of the characters in the decks don't actually have to be in their decks to be functional characters. So, for example, let's say that you've played around with the Sonic deck and you really like the way Knuckles works. He's got a really high charge value, he's got a really hard-hitting attacks, but you're not really into the Sonic deck, but you still want to keep using Knuckles, there's really no problem in just taking Knuckles out of the deck and throwing him into another deck that you might like a little bit better. Like, he'd probably work really good in, like, Dragon Ball Z deck. That kind of player freedom is the tops, because you can look at a character and see, okay, here are all of the options that this character has, and here's the role that it's meant to serve, rather than just looking at it as part of an archetype or looking at it as part of a set of cards that you need to play around it. If you like Knuckles, throw Knuckles in a deck with something else that you like, and Knuckles will just fill the role of being a frontline bruiser, essentially. Overall, I just think that that's the best part of the game, is just how free and how many options each player has when they're both building their decks and playing the game. When you're in a match, you never feel like there's no chance you have a winning. Even if you're staring down a level 5 and you've got only like level 2s and 3s, you can always put on an equip card that'll turn the tide of battle. You can choose between attacking and defending, and if you manage your charge values, then you should be okay. There's always something you can do to come back in a game, and I think that's really nice. I also think it's really nice that there's something like the critical mechanic, where even if a character is technically weaker, there's always a chance for you to come back and win in a clash, because you never know who's going to roll what on the dice, and there's always that chance of rolling a 0. So there's not one clear winner when you go into a battle, and I think that's why the game did so well back in the day. As somebody who got a chance to try the game for himself with other players, it's incredibly addictive to go into a match and just see exactly what's going to happen in a battle, and it makes it so that you're not going to play the same game twice, ever. There's no chance of you playing the same game twice, because you just never know which characters are going to be in battle at what time, and what each player is going to roll on the dice. Like, honestly, a character could just get really bad luck and just get one shot by an attack. Somebody comes in, rolls up with their times 50 attack, and just rolls a 5 against a 0 and does 250 damage and offs a character. It's really interesting the way that goes. And it's a sort of like a warlike mindset you have to play this game, because you have to plan for all possible outcomes. And that gives you a lot of freedom as a player, because every move that you make, you don't have to worry about min-maxing, because the game is just so chaotic that any move you make is probably going to be the right move, as long as it's a move that you enjoy. You don't have to worry about min-maxing your characters. You can use whatever characters you enjoy, just like Weiss Schwarz, oddly enough. And when you go into a battle and you want to try something, whatever you decide to do is totally fine. If your opponent goes in with a times 10, do you go in with a times 100 to try and completely obliterate them in one shot and risk something happening to your attack and your attack not going through anyways? Maybe. Do you go in with your own times 10 attack to try and step over them for a little bit of damage and save your times 100 for when they do their times 100? Maybe. That sounds fine too. Do you just defend? It's a lot cheaper. You won't get any damage off, but you also have the chance of wasting your defend if they end up not rolling good anyways. Maybe. Don't know. You just never know the outcome until after everything has happened, and I think that's very liberating, because you never have to feel like you're playing wrong necessarily. You just play the way that you think is the most fun way to play, and whatever you think is right, I mean, nobody can really judge you for, because it's all in the roll of the dice. But again, like I said before, the game's not perfect. It's too long, needed to be changed, needed to be streamlined a little bit. The clash zone should be where your characters stop moving. That should just be it. I really think the idea of changing up the deck so that you don't have a deck that you draw from and you just start with a field of characters, and then just from the turn 1, you and your opponent start going at it, would have made the game a lot more fun. Probably brought the matches down to about 30 minutes, and you could get to the most epic part of the game just at the beginning of the match every single time. Now, the other thing that we have to talk about, obviously we can't avoid any longer, is the fact that the game is essentially stolen. Okay, sure, the idea for the game isn't stolen, but I think that's what makes it even more annoying to me, is the fact that in order for this game to have worked, they essentially had to use these franchises as a crutch. I talked to this guy. I know that he was capable of doing more unique stuff. Told me about all of these things that he did. This story called Pajama Man and Teddy Bear Boy, which is pretty interesting and also had a card game attached to it. This story called Combat System, essentially about reincarnation and these guys to get executed for using something that they weren't supposed to save their kingdom. But even though they saved their kingdom, they ended up getting executed anyways because they did something they weren't supposed to, and then they get angry, come back, and then they have to fight their reincarnated selves. Sounds really interesting. There are spirits beyond, which is this thing about like the spirit who comes to Earth and is like his entire job is to get people to believe in magic again, to start bringing magic back. Honestly, there's all these interesting ideas. I feel like he could have easily not used copyrighted material as a crutch in order to make his game. You guys know how I feel about using assets and using copyrighted stuff to make your game. I think it's kind of weak. I think if your card game's got a really good idea, that it should just live on that by itself. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm not gonna get too hard on him. He was like 13 when he made this game, so all right, more power to you. If you want to make a card game where Inuyasha and Link have a sword fight, then that's totally fine. Whatever, I guess. Something else I want to throw out here, just for legal purposes, I suppose, is the creator didn't really make money off of this game. Essentially, people would give him money for the game, but he would use that to buy supplies, which, as somebody who made card games himself when he was younger, I know how expensive it can get. You've got to buy ink for your printer, you've got to buy all of the cards, you've got to buy a lot of stuff, and especially in a game like this where there were events going on with unique cards, for example, and all of this, I could see where the money would really help, because if you're printing too many cards, man, it can get really expensive. I don't think people even realize how expensive ink really gets. Before we get too far off the copyrighted thing, I think the other thing that really bothers me is, okay, if you're going to use copyrighted characters for your game, okay, whatever, it's fine. But, I mean, we're really crossing the line when we're just straight up stealing artwork, right? Like, come on, man. There's no credits given. Clearly, it's just Google image searched, and you just ripped it and you put it on a card, and yeah, the creator's never gonna see any kind of credit for it. It's really weak stuff. I don't know. Maybe if you're gonna do something like this, keep it to official artwork only. But even then, it's a little bit. It's just a little bit suspect. You know, it's a little bit sus. Because I don't know. He's just not only taking the franchises, but also stealing artwork to make a game that you're technically taking money for, because you're even though you're using the money to buy art supplies and stuff, I don't know, it's kind of distasteful. It doesn't really sit well with me. But anyways, I guess the game's defunct. It's probably never coming back, so I mean, there's really only so much I can complain about. To summarize everything, I do think the game itself is really good. It just needed to be streamlined a bit, and yeah, who knows, man. If this game were streamlined, and if this game were made simpler with, you know, not stolen artwork or not stolen characters, then I think this game could have actually been an actual contender for a card game. I think people would want to sit down and play this as long as the matches didn't go past like 20 to 30 minutes. So, yeah, not too bad, dude. Not too bad. What was your name again? Cyberlink. Oh my gosh, that is so early 2000s. But anyways, thank you, Cyberlink, so much for letting me look at your game. It was a fun time, and if the audience likes it, I'd be more than happy to go back and look at even more. But yeah, thank you all so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like. Those things really do help me out. Let me know if you want to see more of this game or anything else you want to see in the comments section below. Hopefully, one day I'll actually get to a decent upload schedule that I stick to. And finally, subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Kudo news. Now, if y'all don't mind, I'm just going to check my email super quick. Alright, nothing really here. Let's log into League of Legends, check out what the new update's like. Wait a second. Oh, wait a second. I'm Cyberlink. I made this game. Whoops!